So good morning, everybody. I'm in Rome, in a dear friend's house, and I'm particularly happy to introduce Selim Rauer. Dr. Rauer is a research fellow and junior faculty at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism at the Hebrew University. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in the United States and the Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris. His thesis examines the territorialities of foreigners in French and Francophone contemporary literature and drama in a socio-historical and political context, exposing traumatic and post-traumatic memories related to colonialism and the Shoah. He's the author of a novel, La Passion de Pierre, on Pierpaolo Pasolini, Freddie Mercury, and several collections of poems, among them Landscape and Les Sables et les Conteux. He has published in various literary and academic peer-reviewed journals, such as Les Règles du Jeu, Africa Cultures, and more recently, Les Revues littéraires, Modern Drama and Research in African Literature. Dr. Rauer will be speaking today on the enemy as a necropolitical archetype, rhizomic structures of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in France, 19th and 21st century. Please let's welcome Selim, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I really appreciate, and thank you to all of you for being so numerous for this Zoom seminar. I really appreciate it, really. So what I'm going to present today is, so I'm going to do it, as I was saying from the outset, a bit in the old school manner. So I'm not going to do a PowerPoint presentation or whatever, even though I could have been presenting you, but I didn't thought that this seminar required any sort of iconography, but it could have been illustrated by many coverages or comparison could have been done between caricatures, anti-Semitic caricatures that have been published in France in the 19th century, and press coverage that have been doing until a very recent time by French medias and by the French press. So what I'm going, this reflection I'm going to start is part of a larger component about the power of death over life, and how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are part of a larger rhizomic structure that includes as well the Anthropocene. I'm not going to approach the question of the Anthropocene today, but I'm going to put at the core of this reflection a concept that has been defined, that has been developed by the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, which is the concept of necropolitics, which is the reverse mirror of Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics. So I will try to, this is at once a philosophical and sociological, historical approach of the question. So I will just start by trying to consider the topics of enmity, biopower, economy, and the manipulative uses of what we call the French Republican values. So the destiny of Jewish diasporas in Europe and France over 1 millennium is the history of continuous relegation and hunting, exclusion and seclusion. In the same way, the colonial history connected to Arab and Muslims, as we will see, rearticulates dynamics of cultural and geographical relegation and discrimination in the colonial and in different manners in the post-colonial time and spaces, allowing for the production of an harmful civilizational figure, the enemy, the one from within as much as the one from the other side of the border. Is there a history of enmity arising through the political theological dualism of Judaism and Islam, or as most more tribally articulated by Gilles Anijar, between the Jew and the Arab in Europe? On the one side, the theological enemy, Judaism; on the other side, the political enemy, Islam. And by engaging with this reflection on the theological and sociopolitical roots of enmity within the realm of monotheism, Anijar does not forget to address an additional component to his study. He considers a symbolic and biopolitical paradigm that has defined modern approaches of national politics and geostrategic interests, which is Carl Schmitt's which was, as you know, one of the legal jurists who was defined the racial of Nuremberg, Carl Schmitt's notion of the friend and the enemy, which is part of the concept of the political published in 1932. So this binary drive has characterized legal and political praxis, as well as shaped theological political grounds for sovereignty and identity in Western societies, but not only. The figure of the enemy has profoundly impacted the French Christian imaginary, which has symbolically and culturally survived the unfinished or unaccomplished process of French secularism known as laicity. Unaccomplished or unfinished since the law of December 1905 keeps being reinterpreted and defined following different approaches and national identity concerns that spans over the whole spectrum, political spectrum in our present time, as we will see. The nature of political and cultural confrontation at stake with the emergence of French modernity, or more briefly said, of the French Revolution and the birth of the First Republic between 1792 and 1804, offers a good instance about this dialectical tension that operates through ideological identity interests. So the colonial enterprise has used racial cultural construction as standards to legitimate an alleged civilizational superiority that conflates with the notion of mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, which has been juxtaposed by French governments during their imperialistic accomplishments. This rhetoric somehow finds its roots in, and that might sound surprising, in Nicolas de Condorcet's thought during the French Revolution in its sketches for the political picture of the human mind, where he legitimates a logic of earthly dominion by enlightenment under the noble excuse of the Enlightenment. So a dominion that fundamentally aims at sizing human and natural supplies to secure a constant economic growth related to a territorial expansion that essentially discloses the very concept of sovereignty. It means the ability for the sovereign of the state to attain optimal independence through various geopolitical, economic, and legislative means. And this economic perspective, linked to energy independence and industrial development, has mostly contributed to the French colonial project and to the occupation of foreign countries, some of them substantially populated by Arabs and Muslims. They have been demonized, devaluated, labeled inferiors with the help of purported scientific tools provided by such celebrated figures as Ernest Renan under the Third Republic. This is, among others, recalled by Olivier Lecourt-Grandmaison in his recent essay, Ennemi Mortel. So Islamophobia, in that sense, is in France the product of a sociocultural imaginary combined with political economic constructions, sending back to the colonization period of North Africa and part of the Middle East, and especially of Algeria. This country was integrated into France as a region composed of 3 different departments: Oran, Algiers, and Constantine. The French Islamophobic roots connect as well with the still vivacious history of the Algerian War of decolonization and the uttermost peak of violence toward Muslims and Arabs reached on October 17th, 1961, with the so-called Paris Massacre. The latter resulted in the murdering of 200 Arab demonstrators and protesters supporting the decolonization process and thrown into the Seine River following orders given at the time by the head of the Parisian police, Maurice Papon. As you might know, Maurice Papon is a man also known as a notorious collaborationist during the Vichy regime. So this multi-layered phase of Islamophobia in France, tying up constructed and cultivated memories of a different other perceived as an enemy, the Muslim invader lying on the other side of the Mediterranean border or beyond the Bosphorus River, as well as the Arab opponent resisting colonization or launching a war of decolonization, as well as the essential image of Muslims stigmatized as terrorists, and more specifically after the 9/11 events, compose what the French scholar Vincent Gézer defined in metropolitan France as new Islamophobia. And he develops these notions as an answer in a critical and complementary manner to another publication made around the same period in 2002, a publication made by Pierre-André Taguieff, New Judeophobia. So I would like to approach now how in the
can you slow down the rhythm of the speaking?
Yeah, of course, if you like, yeah.
Yes, no, because I see that. Okay, sorry, I didn't want to disturb you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I would like to approach now in the actual French political context, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, how they are found on similar cultural phobic territories but have also gently risen in France in recent years, as the works of the sociologist Marwan Mohamed and Abdiali Ajat show. So my position is that by way of assemblages drawing on Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's thought on the rhizomic structure, as well as on racialized biopolitical concern, as they emerge in Alexander J. Viheliu's essay Habeas Viscus, Islamophobia, as much as anti-Semitism today in France, and anti-Semitism in the course of the last 2 centuries in France and Europe, have overtaken many changing forms, images, shifting from one location to another, becoming a space of imaginary reconstructions based on an idea of alterity conceived as a danger or an existential threat, apparently related to identity problematics through emotions and fears transferred into a cultural spot in times of economic and political crisis. This created fear offers some leverage, some ascendancy and command to exercise a biopolitical power that eventually divulges its true technological influence. Border, territories, skin color, rituals, traditions, religions, gender, sexuality, language, all these concepts and topics may become the different entrance door and culturally reconstructed paradigms imposing a distinct interpretation and view over history, over the course of events, and what we pretend to be the truth in order to enable a pastoral address or articulation that satisfies or allows for the constitution of an alleged public opinion, something that should subsequently support a purported position reflecting the opinion of the almighty majority. So France is a secular country in which the notion of, one might say sometimes, the doctrine of laicity acts out in public political discourses and the media as a double-edged sword, reaching far beyond the realm of law itself. French laicity turns up as a cultural place of distortions wherein judgment and affects play a far more essential function in defining the societal border, the center, and the margins. And this law was established to guarantee civil peace and blossom of cults of intimacies and identities within legal and political frames granted by the French Republic. So what does this law of December 9, 1905 precisely say? I'm quoting the article number 1. The Republic guarantees freedom of conscience. It guarantees the free exercise of cults under the only restrictions enacted below in the interest of public order. Article 2. The Republic does not recognize, pay, or subsidize any cult, except for the expenses relating to chaplaincy exercises and intended to ensure the free exercise of worship in public institutions such as high schools, colleges, schools, hospices, asylums, and prisons. It also states in the Article 28, it is forbidden to raise or affix any religious sign or emblem on public monuments or in any public place whatsoever, except for religious building, burial grounds, in cemeteries, funerary monuments, as well as museums or exhibitions. So, shortly said, the law of December 9, 1905 on laicity strictly and formally expresses an absolute separation between the state and the church, but doesn't forbid at all the right of any French citizen to express, practice, or disclose, if so is their choice, their faith or religiosity, or to communicate their religious or political opinions with and to others. So this very last aspect is also of course covered and protected by the law on freedom of expression, which has legally been developed in the course of the French Revolution, lighted in 1789, and present in the Article 11 of the French Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights. One of its most notable legal limits being hate speech, moral harassment, or the disclosing of any private matter on account of any individual without their consent. And in recent times in France, and more especially in the course of the last 40 years, Islam has more often than not been the object of many essentializations, stigmatization, and generalizations affecting French Muslims and Muslim communities by way of denouncing a purported way of living, clothing, an alleged dual relation to citizenship, education, and culture in general, targeting on the first line Muslim women. So this Islamophobic aggression discloses a rather misogynist judgment by alleging that Muslim women are per se submissive and necessarily enduring the dominant will of their masculine environment produced by this particular religion. What we can notice here is a combined relation to misogyny, patriarchy, and xenophobia appended to Islam, to Arabs in a long historical colonial genealogy, and Muslim women concerning their ability to make choices for themselves. And laicity has become a place of identity and political reconstruction, allowing for incrimination and censorship rather than cultural diversity in the post-colonial time and space. This cultural distortion has also profoundly affected French Jews. Laicity at the time of its political and legal development under the rule of the Third Republic triggered a strong rejection of the Catholic Church and its influence in a country that was baptized prior to the Revolution as the eldest daughter of the Church. This rejection of the Catholic Church played out an important connector function with the forms antisemitism and Islamophobia symbolically overtook in the 20th and 21st centuries. Laicity is now the reverse mirror of freedom of cult and expression. We can relate to the deeply rooted anti-Semitic history of the Catholic Church in Europe, which might help explain, as Robert Michael discloses, how and why Nazi ideology found such a favorable ground to the most violent buildup of its scapegoat rhetoric toward Jews far beyond the German-speaking geographical space. As Michael recalls, the Christian Church attempted to establish its own unique identity as independently as possible from Judaism. To achieve this, the Church cast the Jews in the role of aliens, monsters, pariahs. Antisemitism and racism were theoretically and culturally merged by the Christian Church long before the supra-racial or meta-racial interpretations commanded by the German Nazi regime. As the Father Giuseppe Oreglia wrote in the Jesuit journal Civiltà Cattolica, I'm quoting, "Jews are not only Jews because of their religion, they are also Jews and especially because of their race." And this hatred reached demonic grounds during the medieval time through hateful utterances, opening the door to the legitimation of killings and massacres during crusades. The most influential of medieval theologians, the Dominican Thomas Aquinas, even considered Jews as slaves to the church and Christian princes. Through this anti-Judaic speech, he permitted any further cultural and socio-political constructions, licensing the production of an enemy figure such as the court Jew, who acted as an army provisioner, moneylender, administrator, banker, and a tax collector. So the political construct of the Jewish usurer was ready-made as Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice in 1605 and its main character Shylock show, and became a cultural magnet of public ire. And part of the anti-Semitic fury that prompted in the public opinion in France by the end of the 19th century through the Dreyfus affair can be explained by this long Catholic and Christian anti-Semitic tradition deeply rooted for centuries in French Christian cultural unconscious and transmitted from one generation to another. By the end of 1894, the Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish citizen with Alsatian origins, is summoned to show for a regular inspection. He eventually collects a letter from a senior officer stating that he is accused of high treason for communicating secret documents to the German Imperial Army. What follows is a closed trial during which Dreyfus is found guilty, condemned to life imprisonment, and relegated to the Devil's Island penal colony in French Guiana. Following French writer Émile Zola's famous article, J'accuse, defending the cause of a degraded captain, Dreyfus is granted a second trial in 1899, during which he is again declared guilty. However, due to the tremors going through public opinion, Alfred Dreyfus is offered a pardon, which he accepts by President Émile Loubet the same year. As stated by Jean-Denis Bredin in his exhaustive study of the toxic anti-Semitic affair that remains emblematically attached to the history of the French Republic, he writes, "It was during that period that the colonial party was organized. In the chamber, the colonial group had become powerful and active. The Ministry of Colonies was created in 1894. Apparently, the public no longer viewed the idea of colonization with the same indifference or hostility that it had 10 years earlier." So what emerges here, as a matter of fact, this is how a staged anti-Semitic trial and affair, which has furiously animated the French society, also became a screen or a catalyzer watering down, or at least softening debates around French colonial endeavors abroad. And as recalled by Robert Michael, the figure of the enemy, as far as the European Jewish communities and diasporas are concerned, relies back on the old biblical dual paradigm of the adversary brother and the myth of the first perpetrated crime in Judeo-Christian imaginary through the assassination of Abel by his elder brother Cain. And here, in this case, Cain equates for the Jewish community in its entirety made responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, who is Abel, a suspicious and dangerous spiritual community that should be relinquished to the margins of society, if not persecuted as an heretic metaphysical enemy. The national betrayal of which Captain Dreyfus was wrongly accused symbolized the image of the martyred body of the nation at the end of the 1870 war. France, in this logic, equates, in this anti-Semitic Christian imaginary, the Corpus Christi given by a traitor, Judah, to the empire, that of Bismarck's Prussian Germany. So one forgotten aspect when it comes at elucidating the origins and some of the few possible common bounds between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in contemporary France is that the dynamics at work in French anti-Semitism have laid out some of the political rhetorical elements connected to the notion of origins, as the socio-historian Gérard Moriel asserts. The publication of Édouard Drumon's book, La France Juive, Jewish France, which is a 1,200 pages anti-Semitic composition, initiated in 1886, a genre appeal to encounter massive success in modern French editorial history under the name of Le Brûlot Pamphlétaire, the lampoon of the Red Hot Book, endorsing the prosecutive function against the whole community by way of an imaginary organized around stigmatizing racial and cultural elements, has played a very important role. This role has been rearticulated in modern times, as we can see, following the same constructions with the theory of the Great Replacement that has been enunciated and celebrated by far-right outsiders like the French writer Renaud Camus. Édouard Drumon's book met a massive success for its time, reaching a book-selling record of 80,000 copies. And this violent and asserted anti-Semitic scientific abysmal demonstration by a journalist who craved legitimation as a noble writer, as an homme de lettres, has been reprinted on many occasions. Drumon's book sums up all the anti-Jewish historical utterances of its time. They derive, among others, from traditional Christian anti-Semitic discourse relating to the court Jew figure and its contended relation to finance and power. By this means, Drumont found an opportunity to aggress and damage French Jewish families such as the Rothschilds or the Nissim Commandos, which played a significant cultural and socioeconomic position during the Third Republic. Drumont also found the opportunity to damage left-wing secular Jews, and this is of particular interest, as you will see. They embraced the Marxist notion of a class struggle, and they were also strong supporters of Aristide Briand's last draft on what was to become the Law on Laicity on December 9, 1905. A law that initially targeted the Catholic Church and its overwhelming interference into French public and political life. The context of a progressive and sometimes vehement, even violent secularization of the country during which the historical influence of Catholicism was denounced by French socialists such as Léon Gambetta, connected with other socio-historical and economic occurrences such as the defeat of the French-Prussian War of 1870, the expansion of economic liberalism generating larger dichotomies in the society. All this mingled all together and resulted in the need to find a scapegoat. And I would like to remind you here a definition of the scapegoat in archaic societies as given by the French anthropologist René Girard. The scapegoat is the one that feels an emptiness, satisfies a dead angle of consciousness, seeking artificially to rebuild a link within a troubled community. Girard says, to have a scapegoat is not to know that one has it. It is to take him for a real culprit who, by dying as he deserves, seems to become for purely mimetic reasons the genuine savior of the community. So this leads me now to another occurrence. On October 27, 2018, a man entered a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and shot down 11 people who gathered for prayer. The murderer shouted anti-Semitic slurs recalling antique Christian anti-Jewish delirious proclamations such as, "Jews are children of Satan." And just after his arrestation, the police led thorough investigations on social networks and asked the killer why he decided to focus his hate on Pittsburgh Jewish community. And his answer was, evil Jews brought evil Muslims into the country. So this statement recalls the European collusion or alliance theory between Jews and Muslims in medieval times, which has been scrutinized by historians such as Alan Harris Cutler and Ellen Elmquist Cutler in their common essay, The Jew as an Ally of the Muslims, Medieval Roots of Antisemitism, a book that stirs sharp critics among its peers. As the socio-historians Abdelali Ajat and Marwan Mohamed point out, by leaning, among others, on Bernard Blumenkrantz researches, an essay, Jewish and Christian in the Western World, the aftermath of the Saint Sepulchre Church destruction in Jerusalem by Sultan Hakim in 1009 opened the gate in Christian Europe to the most brutal persecutions toward Jewish populations considered as the main instigators and supporters of this event. The rupture that occurred between Christian and Jewish communities during the 11th century concerning Muslim expansion in the whole Mediterranean basin seems to remain engraved and rearticulated in contemporary anti-Semitism and still animate anti-Semitic crimes in the 21st century on the other side of the Atlantic. Here emerges, by way of assemblages, one of the many forms that racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, or Islamophobia can overtake through their biopolitical rhizomic and rhizomatic flexible structures in the human mind. This very idea responds to Michel Foucault's notion of state racism that will serve to structure and justify belligerent geostrategies and cultural conceptions generated by the sovereign or governments that are eager to embolden and defend their authority. What the French philosopher stresses behind the notion of racist war in the 17th and 18th centuries finds a contemporary support and conceptual geopolitical actualization in the neoconservative ideology of the American political scientist Samuel Huntington and his book The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. In France, as mentioned in the United States, the rhetoric and nostalgic conception of remaking or reconnecting with imaginary roots sounds like a missive to reactualize and re-enliven something that might have been enfeebled or lost. The concept of sovereignty might signify very diverse and conflicting applications. The exact same consideration can be made on the account of power, a notion that very often relates to an exercise of mastery or domination. It means the powers of the state or the sovereign over its population, over other populations, but also fundamentally over life. And this notion of your power that implicates the rights of death and power over life has been unfolded in an eponymous essay concluding the first volume of Foucault's Histories of Sexuality. This belligerent conception and use of power have historically structured all forms of colonization and imperialisms around the globe. If we take the French colonial instance and its imaginary power, interestingly, Edouard Said quotes in his essay Culture and Imperialism in 1994 one of the most fervent French colonization advocates, Jules Armand. He is a naval physician, natural scientist, and colonial administrator in Southeast Asia. And he states in 1910, I'm quoting, "It is necessary then to accept as a principle and point of departure the fact that there is a hierarchy of races and civilizations, and that we belong to the superior race and civilization, still recognizing that while superiority confers rights, it imposes strict obligations in return. The basic legitimation of conquest over native peoples is the conviction of our superiority, not merely our mechanical, economic, and military superiority, but our moral superiority. Our dignity rests on that equality, and it underlies our right to direct the rest of humanity. Material power is nothing but a mean to that end." End of the quote. So it is precisely this reactionary and contrived notion of remaking or making again that structures contemporary far-right policies in North America and in Europe. This conservative and, let us say, fascist form of thinking articulates two different dialectics. On the one side, an imperative need to maintain an assembled primitive cultural order, allowing to strengthen the community and its so-called command based on racial cultural constructions. On the other, based on these assumptions, the necessity to expand its authority and to regulate or fulfill its need through expansionist maneuvers, facilitating the characterization of an enemy, whether internal or external. In both cases, the border emerges as a pivotal definition, allowing either for inclusion or connection, or exclusion and relegation. Historically, in Christian anti-Semitic imaginary, the Jew represents the different other living among their peers in Europe. The closest one within internal borders that might get stigmatized, tyrannized, excluded, or even killed. He is the cultural and metaphysical other, the brother enemy. The Muslim represents a different form of otherness identifiable at the other side of the border. As a community, they appear either in the form of civilizational threat constructs or as a geopolitical opponent in Western imaginary. And these interpretations of the Muslim can be found historically in the course of European and French cultural culture. You have it in Jean Baudel's Jeu de Saint-Nicolas, written around the turning of the year 1200, after the end of the Third Crusade, representing the conversion of Saracens to Christianity, which might have played a propagandist role for its time to undertake a fourth crusade toward Jerusalem. It takes also the shape of the enlightened adversary, as is the case in the character of Pasha Selim in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, The Abduction of the Seraglio in this opera. Other romantic or light romantic pictorial depictions of the Orient sustain such a violent civilizational imaginary, such as Eugène Delacroix's Death of Sardanapalus, responding to Lord Byron's Sardanapalus play. You also have The Fanatics of Tangier and The Tiger Hunt. So there is, as Edouard Said shows, a Western Orientalist tradition of representing Islam and the Middle East as an essentialized, distant, and unpenetrable culture. The latter oscillates between a mere depiction of barbarity and irrational brutality appended to whole civilization, and a wish to abort boundaries with a society and a population that remains stigmatized as an indigenous subculture. In both cases, we are confronted with imaginary juxtaposition and reconstructions in which war, race, otherness, the experience of the aborted Napoleonic campaigns, and the arising of colonial enterprises allowed for multi-layered productions, that of an objectified, almost inexistent other. So as Fernando Bravo Lopez recalls, there is a similarity in the way antisemitism and Islamophobia have been or still being produced by way of religious, cultural, but also racialized combinations, developing a structure that can be entered through many entries. And this admits for a multidimensional correlation of views and experiences, which find their connection in numerous affects and imaginaries, which can either be Christian, nationalist, secular, racial, neocolonial, patriarchal, overarching a political spectrum spanning from the far right to the far left, and traversing the right, the left, and the center of the so-called third way. A third way, as is the case in France now, generally presenting itself as being liberal in terms of societal considerations, but conservative in economic terms, which shows on that matter a peculiar difference with other political movements, being very keen to stigmatize and instrumentalize national discussions where immigration, Islam, and security are mingled all together and permitting to polarize political debate and attention. So we're dealing here with the actualization of the Schmittian notion of the friend and the enemy implemented in a particular political context, which can be a sheer rhetorical or notional creation, allowing for distortion and exploitations in public discourses. Following Foucault, this precise definition applies to liberalism and its German version as well, ordoliberalism, which is an art of governing, as he says, that fundamentally manipulates interests by being the manager of danger and security freedom mechanisms that lie at the heart of the nation state. So Carl Schmitt gives in his own terms this notion of the following idea. I'm quoting Carl Schmitt. Humanity as such cannot wage war because it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. The concept of humanity excludes the concept of the enemy because the enemy does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no specific differentiation in that concept. That wars are waged in the name of humanity is not a contradiction of this simple truth. Quite the contrary. It has an especially intensive political meaning. When a state fights its political enemy in the name of humanity, it is not a war for the sake of humanity, but a war wherein a particular state seeks to usurp a universal concept against its military opponent. At the expense of its opponents, it tries to identify itself with humanity in the same way as one can misuse peace, justice, progress, and civilization in order to claim these as one's own and to deny the same to the enemy. End of the quote. So if, as the German legal terrorist asserts, the concept of humanity excludes the hypothesis of the enemy, Islam and Judaism have been bested through anti-Judaic and anti-Muslim rhetorics into an outer human realm, a cultural, racial, and metaphysical space where spirituality and identity converge into a form of political, physical, and ideological threat that requires unlimited banishment, exclusion, or even the suspension of the norm, the suspension of the law that fundamentally expresses sovereignty in Schmittian terms, as Giorgio Agamben has demonstrated it. So this happens in order to eliminate this enemy. Beyond this necropolitical logic, asserting the powers of death over life, emerges a whole history of domination that embraces at once the history of the Shoah and the long-lasting experience of colonialism, enabled through what Frantz Fanon has expressed as being the complicity of capitalism with the most violent forces that spread over the colonized territories. This notion of enmity is very organic to the history and genealogy of Islamophobia, as Ajad and Mohammed show in their common essay, Islamophobia, How French Elites Manufacture the Muslim Issue. Contradictorily to many unfounded speculation, the use of the term Islamophobia has not been launched by Iranian mullahs attempting to exercise censorship over any critics concerning Islam and the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, whether as a religious nor as a political movement or event. It has not been either a recent creation of the Muslim Brotherhood or a political theological plot deriving from any individual enthused by jihadist Islamism. The first use of the term Islamophobia can be found in an article published in 1910 by an at that time so-called French ethnologist administrator Maurice Delafosse, introspecting and scrutinizing the French administrative colonial space and its jurisdictions. In a writing piece on the state of Islam in Western Africa, Delafosse denounces the sheer hostility and discriminatory practices of some appointees of the French colonial administration toward Muslims. The historian Patricia Lorsin has particularly well investigated this aspect. She exposes how French colonial administration stigmatized and discriminated Muslims and Arabs in French Algeria through legal means in the late 19th century. And this attempt to divide the various indigenous communities in the French colonizing process of Algeria, as much as the racialization of Islam, allowed for the ethnic, cultural, and ethical discriminatory associations finding a biopolitical function as asserted by Vehelia. What lies beneath Islamophobia and what structures it is not only prejudice or religious or cultural dynamics of stigmatization, but an intertwinement of racial and xenophobic discourses, finding a space of application within the civilizational or cultural possibility of Islam itself. The latter becomes the legal and political era of a possible essentialization for Muslim diasporic communities without any regard, as for the French instance, for the religious diversity and the intern antagonisms and dialectics animating such a large cultural group. So this way of essentializing diasporic groups as multifaceted and contradictory as the Muslim communities, and more specifically such a miscellaneous group of nearly 6 million French citizens who live, practice, reflect, and experience their faith in so many different combinatory and imaginary ways, is very actual in contemporary France. The connection is very quickly made to jihadist and Wahhabist terrorist activism, and the sociocultural imaginary and racial historical prejudices are connecting to this theological political construction of the enemy that is proper to the 9/11 era. So this sort of theorization has been academically structured and recently fashioned by one of the most famous French scholars and historians, Pierre-André Taguieff, with his book Islamism and Us, Considering the Unforeseen Enemy. We can ask ourselves what lingers underneath this us and what characterizes this enemy defined as an unforeseeable or unpredictable essentialized figure. This judgment equates the idea that Jews or Muslims are in the anti-Semitic as much as in Islamophobic perceptions, essentially considered as unpredictable, prepared for any form of conspiracy. They become sources of insecurity and anxiety, intrinsically core to their identity. this brings to what the scholar Julieta Singh states about how identity should be mastered, when she says that identity need to be weakened to a point of fracture. And this dynamic discloses the process of thingification expressed by Aimé Césaire in his discourse on colonialism written in 1955. So this dynamic of enmity at work is something that can be observed in various defaming and insensibilizations impetuses developing both from Islamophobic and anti-Semitic discourses. If Islam or Muslims are easily interconnected with an extreme brutality and manipulated through the lens of terrorist actions, such as the one that befell in France during the night of November 13, 2015, anti-Jewish resentments and assertions disguised in the form of anti-Zionist statements tends to shortcut the relation between the State of Israel and its interior and foreign policies with the entire Jewish diasporas and communities around the globe, as well as the entire Israeli population, without making any sort of distinction between identities, events, circumstances, emotion, and historical facts. And in each case, events, geopolitical realities, imaginary construction, affects, identity relations are denied, transformed, or erased, and subsumed to allow for the delusional rational production of fierce anti-Semitic or Islamophobic crescendos and stanzas, compounding the imaginary creation trap of the enemy. What the anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish contemporaneous discourses attempt to perform is to remove a multiplicity of persons, memories, histories, and affects, it means humanities, to refashion them into the one single fantasized theological political arrangement that allows for the presentation of a language and practices that dehistorizes and relinquishes the other to the status of disembodied individual, to the object, to the fetish, something demonized and devaluated that justifies at best despise, estrangement, and forgetfulness, at worst hate and annihilation. The genealogical and historical filiation between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in modern France can be found in a pretty much troubling manner if one considers the argumentations and dynamics wielded in political discourses and publication types and narrative, which stigmatizing infrastructures have been established in the relentless attempt to classify, criminalize, and relegate French Jewish citizens to the margins of society. As explained by Norbert Elias, we find in both cases a dynamic of discrimination that operates through a dualistic reading grid, through which the image of the person appears as being either situated within the cluster of an established community or part of the outsiders group. Various Islamophobic columnists and intellectual likes at the beginning of the 21st century are more or less indebted to the anti-Semitic methodology of Édouard Drumont's France Juive, a writing legacy which culminated 51 years later with Louis-Ferdinand Céline horrifying anti-Jewish lampoon, Bagatelle pour un massacre. Authors such as Éric Zemmour, with his books The French Melancholy, and then The French Suicide and French Destiny, or Alain Finkielkraut with L'Identité Malheureuse, The Unhappy Identity, or The Only Certainty in 2015, or even Pascal Bruckner with Un racisme imaginaire, La querelle de l'islamophobie, An Imaginary Racism, The Quarrel of Islamophobia in 2017, rearranges these methods of discrimination, of essentialization and denunciation of a troubling, if not undesired other. Someone, in best case, who clutters and distorts a unequivocal national and republican identity while trying to hybridize it with its own values and culture, or in worst case scenario, someone who should be amended, compelled to assimilate, as in the colonial discourse, or to disappear and leave a country and a culture that they are disrupting or corrupting. So following the banlieues uprising of November 2005, Alain Finkielkraut declares to the journalists Dror Michani and Aurelia Samotrait from the daily newspaper Haaretz, I'm quoting him, "In France, we would like to reduce these riots to their social dimension, to see them as a rebellion of the young people of the suburbs against their situation, against the discrimination they suffer, against unemployment. The problem is that most of these young people are blacks or Arabs with a Muslim identity. Look, in France, there are also immigrants whose situation is difficult, Chinese, Vietnamese, Portuguese, and they do not take part in the riots. That is why it is clear that this revolt has an ethnic and religious character. He quotes, I'm quoting him further in the same interview concerning the French football national team and its first, second, and third French generational background. He adds, people say that the French national team is admired by all because it is black, white, Arab. In fact, the French team is now black, 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 which causes sneers throughout Europe. End of the quote. So this sort of xenophobic appreciation discloses the reality of identity constructions proceeding from various paradigmatic grids pertaining, in this case, to an economically racialized discernment deriving from the colonial culture. The latter is associated to a specific bourgeois class consciousness or appreciation of the establishment of law and order, leading to what Georgi Lukács defined as being a dialectical conception of reality, refusing any socio-economical and colonial historical deciphering that will permit to properly understand the origin of specific living conditions and what are the roots of argued integration issues by so-called minorities. This repeatedly used term, minority.
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Selim.
Okay.
Yes, only because I want to open the discussion.
Of course.
I think it's very important.
Okay.
Okay, so if you can wrap up.
I'm trying to wrap up in 5 minutes. Thank you, Manuela.
Okay.
So I was approaching the concept of minorities. So the use of this word, minority, mirrors a neocolonial reality for generations of French citizens with sub-Saharan, Arab or Caribbean origins, which are subject to concrete form of socialization, to very specific urban realities and city policies enabling a ghettoization that joins with the schooling difficulties, but also housing and employment discrimination, creating a neo-racial and cultural relegation in France at the beginning of this century. Nevertheless, the imaginary constructions at work might take different forms, shapes, and allow for different combinations. In the recent case of an Islamophobic aggression made by a French far-right elected representative humiliating a Muslim mother, accompanying a children group within an institutional location, the aggressor, emanating from an historically xenophobic and anti-Semitic party, le Rassemblement National, asked the Muslim mother to take off her veil in the name of laicity and in the name of the friends of enlightenment. So this rhetorical distortion discloses how mediatic political language became, as Guy Debord rightly prophetized it in The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, a space of transformation of reality, for as Gérard Noiriel remembers in his History of Racism and Antisemitism in French 19th and 20th centuries, enlightenment and revolutionary values, as much as laicity and the democratic republic as a political model, were vehemently rejected and fought by far-right parties. In this case, the notion of republican values, laicity, equality, freedom, democracy, is understood within an ethnicist realm dominated by a white Christian and post-Christian culture or civilization versus a doctrinaire Muslim other, considered as the crucible of an obscurantist, barbaric, oppressive, violent identity, the civilizational enemy. So it is definitely this imaginary we can notice at work in Pascal Bruckner's argument in his essay on Islamophobia as imaginary racism. This sort of discourse maintained the idea that French republican values and Islam are incompatible, but also that French Muslims fundamentally, structurally, remain impermeable to civilization or enlightenment, understood as mere Western universal productions, to any form of dialectical reason and critique toward their own belief and theological political imaginary. Comments from writers such as Bruckner on the culturally constructed and manipulated aspect of Islamophobia reminds us of the same sort of actual anti-Semitic statement made by editorialist and self-styled philosopher Etienne Chouard about the impossibility to exercise any critique toward Judaism or Zionism without being immediately labeled an anti-Semite. So I'm quoting Pascal Bruckner when he writes...
And that's we close it.
Okay.
Okay.
Modeled on xenophobia, Islamophobia aims to make Islam an untouchable object under penalty of being accused of racism. This creation, worthy of totalitarian propaganda, maintains a deliberate confusion between a religion, a system of specific piety, and the faithful of all origins who are dear to it. So, I wanted to approach another aspect, but we are apparently too short on time. About the dimension of necropolitics at work. But we can start the discussion now if you like, and I will start with the...
I will do that. Now I tell you, first of all, Selim, thank you very much for this dense and broad lecture on the, you know, on the imaginaire. And I also would stress the fact of the mechanism, how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia function. And it is a pity that Shai Levi left us, because I was eager also to listen to his input. But I would only say one thing, because you touch upon some aspect that I'm very much writing in my own research on the socialization. I think that is a central point. Not because a socialization does not exist, but precisely the anti-Semitic project as the Islamophobic project are by definition project of knowledge in which the essentialization of the other must take place. But I don't want to stop also the others, and I would like to open the floor to the discussion. We have about 35 minutes, and I ask all the speakers to introduce themselves briefly, and then to ask Selim and to open the discussion. And maybe you can add on necropolitics as you intend to. So the floor is open. You raise your hands, or you shake your hands, and I will write down your names. Shai, so you can start.
Thank you, Manuela, and thank you, Selim. My question is on necropolitics, so maybe it would also enable you to give us some of the thoughts at the end of the paper. So there's an argument against Mbembe that the concept of necropolitics is redundant, because already in society must be defended. When Foucault says biopolitics, death is a part of it. Even with the stress on techniques of living, it doesn't mean that we completely abandon techniques of death. And so in the title for this talk, at least, it's the enemy as a necropolitical archetype, but I'm wondering if that sort of focuses only on Islamophobic and anti-Semitic techniques of negation, and therefore omits techniques of production. If we only talk about death, about murder, about killing, about violence, are we not missing techniques of subject formation that you do mention in your talk? You talk about the Banyu's, the assimilationist approaches, the amended individual, the minoritization. So you talk about techniques of subject formation, but the title of the talk and the focus on necropolitics doesn't give us that. We might think that we're still in the 17th century that Foucault discussed, but arguably we are now in the 21st century where we're more in an age of producing the subject than only killing the subject. So the question is, what is the role of necropolitics in current anti-Semitic and Islamophobic discourses?
Well, thank you. This is a great question. You are touching a point. This is what I was announcing at the beginning, that this reflection on the topic of the enemy is only a part of a broader reflection, where I'm trying to connect occurrences, identity occurrences and stigmatization or discriminations with other occurrences that are evolving through the necropolitical logic. That's why I was speaking at the beginning about the Anthropocene, which is the alteration of the changing of life on Earth. So I think that there has been a lot of critique toward Mbembe, saying that it was actually only rephrasing something that had already been phrased before by people like Foucault. But I think that what is important is that he's just underlining one specific dynamic that relates to how we are focusing and employing the power of death over life to create a governance. And this is something very specific to, you can see this sort of necropolitic at work right now in a different case, and in a long historical genealogy and history with the COVID virus and its handling in the United States. You see how a state that has foundations also in slavery is dealing now with such a pandemic, and how this pandemic is touching very specific part of the population. How a social system is built around a specific conception of society that is also based in the slave history of the country. So same thing can be said in a different manner, for instance, about France and the way the cities have been developed in the course of the last century. You see the formation of the banlieues and how the banlieues became sort of post or neo-colonial zones where very specific ethnic groups are to be found at the border, not at the center, that reflects essentially in France the symbolical position of power. So of course, you're totally right. Necropolitics embraces something that is much broader. So in my opinion, and this is what I wanted to do here, is that the antisemitism and Islamophobia in the context of and in the long genealogy of colonialism are just components that are evolving within the realm of necropolitics. One can say that Auschwitz is the purest expression of the necropolitical thought. So this is what I was intending to do, to present how people, individuals, can be essentialized and become sort of objects and fetish that can be broken and devaluated. And this is exactly what happens actually with the Anthropocene, or with a certain or a specific approach of capitalism, where the living in its broader conception is used only as a resource. So I think that the question of alterity and otherness we have to integrate in this reflection, and this is what I think this is what happens since the last decade, and we have to integrate all the forms of living, because we can really perceive how we are depending from a total ecosystem.
Shai, did you other questions to Ivan? No, Irit?
I do have some suggestions as far as the interpretative framework is concerned. My impression is that the main point, one of the main points of this framework based on Carl Schmitt, and it is useful to know that there were some very important arguments against his point. For example, Eric Patterson, 1935-37, which is very unknown, and it would be useful to bring into the argumentation this counter Carl Schmitt argument. The other one, that the burden of the white man's civilization, the usual story, is very important element, but we have to realize the change of the context of this Hughes-Cecil type of concept. That's all.
Selim?
Yeah, what can I say? Thank you for the remark on Patterson. I will have a closer look at it. I think, of course, the context has changed, but what remains is the cultural legacy, and how a cultural legacy goes from one generation to another. So we're not talking about occurrences or an epiphany occurring at one specific point. We're speaking about that's the reason why I was trying to approach the topic in a historical genealogical manner with some methodology, because we're in front of something that follows a long evolution and that inscribes itself into the unconscious of populations. So, of course, contexts are different, but the way we are establishing relations, and all of these relations are determined by the cultural legacy of previous generations. This is what remains, in my opinion. And this is the reason why, actually, one of the best instances, this is the one of the murder in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the sort of cultural association that has been done by the murderer, connecting two different communities in the same way as this has previously happened. So there is a very strong occurrence of the unconscious in such cases. And I think this is also something on which I think Membe has been rightly stressing in his book Politique de l'inimitié, that has been recently translated as Necropolitics in English. This is this idea that the idea of, when we speak about, for instance, post-coloniality, to say post-colonialism doesn't mean that we have been transcending a certain logic of relation. This so-called post-coloniality might mean, as is the case sometimes in France and in the city policies that are established, as a neo-colonial logic that remains culturally. So, yeah, I agree with you. The context has been evolving, but something remains, and we have the proof of that.
If I may intervene in the discussion, I think that Selim, you raised, I would say, very important points about the differentiation, and I'm thinking about that, as I was saying before. What Gila Nijar wrote on the theological and political enemy, that this dichotomy in reality does not really exist. You know, because what you are mentioning, and I very much agree with you, that you talk about the social roles acquired by the other, or the minorities, the Jewish minorities and the Muslim minorities, or I would say the Arab minorities, because even the differentiation, the religious differentiation among the Arabs does not really exist. An Arab is an Arab. Also, if he's a Christian Arab, is still remain an Arab, no? So I would say that this idea of the theological and political enemy is a dichotomy that does not really exist. That is to say, religious aspects and political aspects are combined together. You know, so saying that the Jews were only a religious enemy to a certain point in order to appear Christendom as the only place where, the elective place where the anti-Jewish sentiments came out would be wrong. As would be wrong to say that the Muslims are only a political enemy. That is to say, as if you are a theological enemy, you are not also, by inclusion, also a political one, in which this differentiation, it works in a limited way, unless that we are using it as a tool, in a tool agreement to differentiate between the two groups, but not because we have such a difference. And I would propose to present them together. And what we should, and I think that you show very, very persuasive, in a very persuasive manner, is precisely how it works. Because it does not work in legal terms. Because by the force of the law, there is a model of inclusion. For the Jews and for the Arabs in France, more than other places, because France had an Arab presence, I would say, much earlier than the other imperial country or other countries that they were not even imperial, as in Italy, for example, where the problem exists, but is proposed in another manner. But even the definition that we are using anti-Semitism for the Jews, while we are using for the Arabs Islamophobia. The Islamophobia, the anti-Semitism, from a semantic point of view, they describe one, a fear of the other. No, the Islamophobia, fear of the Arabs, of the Muslims. But while anti-Semitism embrace and encompass our larger elements, and if you want, it has a cumulative nature, because it includes certainly Judeophobia, certainly anti-Judaism, and the question, and you left it out, and this I'm asking also to the other colleagues, is how would you place, or how should we place the word anti-Zionism? Because, and this is a question that I ask myself, should we consider it when we are applying categories in order to describe phenomenon, Jewish presence until the birth of the State of Israel, or should we include the State of Israel in the discourse of anti-Semitism? Because in the eternalist approach in historiography, that it tells the story as a never-ending story of anti-Semitism, in a certain way, the eternalist approach includes the presence of the state of let's say, the history of the Jews after 1948. That it does happen still in the diaspora, and it still happened also in a place that is not Europe and is not America, but in Eretz Israel or Palestine or in the state of Israel, as you want to describe that. It does not really matter which word we are using that. The question is what we use in order to describe more like a political advocacy on the right or on the left, or in favor of the Jews or against the Jews, in favor of the Palestinians or against the Palestinians. That is to say, maybe the words anti-Zionism distorts the discussion if we are talking about anti-Semitism, and it adds other perspectives when we are talking about Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is a much new term of description to the Arab threat. No, it appears mostly as used. I'm not saying as a sentiment. On a sentiment, I completely agree with you that the temporality is much longer. But you mentioned 9/11 as the moment in which there was a summary of anti-Muslim sentiments because of the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. That is to say, we have two long-standing temporalities. You mentioned the Crusades towards the Muslims, but we can go back also to the Roman Empire. It's not that did not exist, the attitude. So it's more like a reflection. I don't have really a clear question on the matter, but I'm wondering if even the terminology that we are using to describe the two phenomenon is really encompass the extent of the phenomenon itself. Because it's true that, and on this, I don't know if we agree or disagree, but anti-Semitism as Islamophobia, and I would say as generic racism, are not analytical categories. They are phenomena that happen in history. The reflection of was reflection, they must start much more on a mythical symbolic level. There is a mythical representation here of otherness that works and occurs in the construction of an historical narrative that in a sense epitomized the otherness. But the function of anti-Semitism as racism and Islamophobia, it belongs to an imaginaire that creates in another, on a model of exclusion, the fear, the contamination, the possibility of destruction of the others. Because legally speaking, laïcité is also the word in which the sociology of the French state includes.
Exactly.
It cannot include and excludes at the same time. If it excludes at the same time, it means that French state has to exclude on a level that is mythical symbolical. What is the symbolic use of the otherness? In which here, I don't see any difference between theology and politics, indeed. I think that they overlap each other, that this fragmentation between one is a theological enemy and is not a political enemy is true and is not true at the same time. It contains a continuity and it contains a rupture. I don't know if I express myself. I'm just working on it now. So I'm bringing to the table my own doubt.
Well, they're interconnected, no? I mean, this...
Absolutely.
Political theology.
Sorry?
Political theology, Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The 4 chapters on political theology. Exactly. They're intrinsically interconnected, and this is as a socio-historian and philosopher, Foucault has been exactly what you just stating. Foucault was in his reflection on the nature of biopolitics. I think this is in his lectures on security, territory, and population. He's approaching the question of the pastoral discourse as a place where politics and theology are intertwined and part of the same component. So the address to the community.
Exactly.
Or discourse. So this is you can put the one aside from the other, even in the secular society, and especially, I think you answer it to yourself by analyzing the French occurrence with laicity. So what you were just stating at the beginning, because French secularism, and this is, if we talk about France, this is probably a larger issue in France, that the French nation has not overcome its relation to the past and to very specific values. For instance, the edification of the Fifth Republic rather respond to something that is actually through the legal means that are in the hands of the French president, that respond to a sort of absolute power that send us back to the Ancien Regime. Laicity in itself, which was specifically developed, so first it was developed against the Catholic Church, which had an immense influence in the French society, but it was also thought in order to allow the flourishment of identities of a country that had changed. And this is very true now. And we see how laicity is being reused as a civilizational dominion. So today, laicity, which has been fought by the far-right parties, is claimed as one of the values of the far-right in France. But they are defining that in a totally different way. It's stranger even when you notice that the so-called left side, which is actually, we'll say social democrats, but people like Manuela Valls, which was the former prime minister, and François Hollande, and the interior minister, has been using laicity as a way of targeting Muslim communities, to denounce their way of living that is not in accordance with laicity. And when an elected Republican is using this sort of rhetorics, he's connecting with something else. So I think what you are considering, rightly, this is also what I'm considering myself. That's why I was underlining this. I was saying that at the beginning that in the methodology I wanted to approach some tools that have been given by people like Deleuze or Guattari when they are talking about the rhizomatic structure and its flexibility. I think this is really what happens. It means that you might be in front of one object, but this object is going to change of form depending on the position you're going to have in relation with it, and which kind of entrance door you're going to use. So we're talking about the same object, but we're entering in it through a different door. And we're changing also is construct by doing that in a certain way. So we're responding very much. The main issue is that we tried, or we pretend that there is a way of understanding such long historical sociological issues by building up a system. But it doesn't work because the same system can be contradicted a little bit later because it changes of form and it's going to be reapplied in a different way. This answers to, in my opinion, I'm not an Israeli citizen, but as a French citizen who has seen in the recent years how anti-Semitism has risen in France in relation with Islamophobia. That's very interesting. And this is what the work of Ajat and Mohammed shows. Both, they are sociologists and they have been analyzing that. Both have been rising up in the country. Very often, people have been using the critique of Zionism as a way to transvestite anti-Semitic discourses. And this has been reactualized and overtaken by a lot of people. So this is, when we are talking about critique toward Zionism, we have to look who is using that word or who is using this sort of critique and in which way, because it doesn't mean that they are criticizing the Zionist ideology. We're talking about Zionism after the establishment or reestablishment of the State of Israel. So this is a different story. Talking about Zionism in 19th century or after 1948. So I think that what happens, this is, the return of the repressed. And the one who answered it, I found that someone made a wonderful statement at one conference we went all together, saying that everything depends on what you are putting behind this word. Zionism. When we went to to Van Leer Institute, one of the participants has been reflecting about the idea that being anti-Zionist or pro-Zionist, we have to look into the specific of what we are putting in those words. That changes the whole reality, and this is really the case in the French context. As for I think that someone like Bruckner has been precisely using this in a reverse manner against Muslim communities that are actually impacted by Islamophobic actions. When he says, "Oh, this is a cultural construction. There is no real Islamophobia. This is a way of denying a cultural pain, an impossibility to integrate a society for people that are actually French." And I saw that. I've been witnessing that in my own community in France. So people who are French, born in France, and enabled or denied as French citizens. This is something that culturally goes on and on and on. And you have to look at the political discourses. And when Michel Foucault once again is talking about the specificity of liberalism as the way of managing interest and in a manipulatory manner, and he says that beyond the moralistic realm, you have the instance of Emmanuel Macron during a speech he made last October about suddenly out of the blue in the middle of a strong social crisis with the Yellow Vest movement, with an opposition that is very vehement about the dichotomies between the classes in the country, something that is actually reactualizing the sociology of the end of the 19th century in France. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, out of the blue, without any reason, without knowing why, Emmanuel Macron comes up and begins to have a talk about the issue of Islam in France. For which reason? And then he wants to have a special commission on laicity. And this is exactly what his predecessor have been doing in such cases. So everything is intertwined in this problematic and is used in a very flexible manner. So sometimes we're perceiving a reality that is not a reality, but only a reflection about something else. And this is why we need to be very, very careful about our way of analyzing that in a systematic manner, because the system changes from one case to another sometimes.
Gabriele, vuoi dire qualcosa? Vuoi chiedere qualcosa? The others have...
Sì, ho scritto, I wrote in the chat my question, do the Jewish communities have a role in their image as it is perceived by the French people? Because, for example, you spoke about anti-Zionism and the link between the Jewish community and Israel. And I really didn't understand if which is the effect of the Jewish community when they show their link to Israel. If the effect is when they show a strong link or a weak link, is there a difference as they are perceived by the French people? That's my question, yes.
Now that's a very interesting point. It's very, as is the case with Islam, the Jewish community, we should speak about Jewish communities in France, and they are also very contradictory, as it was the case historically. So the secular Jewish community is in France very critical toward the governance of the actual state of Israel, for instance, very often. You have the former, one of the main figure is the former president of Médecins du Monde, René Brauman, who has been very strongly criticizing during the last 10 years the policies of the state of Israel. On the other side, you have other people, other French citizen, Jewish citizen, who think that being critic toward Israel implicates, even in the case of René Brauman has been accused of being anti-Semitic. So, you know, some discursive logics pertaining to the localization of the actual government or the former government led by Netanyahu are influencing the way Jewish communities in France are perceiving the reality of Israel and the reality of the Jewish diasporas abroad. And it's also, it reflects the sort of conflict that we have within the French society on the topic of the Israel and Palestine, actually, situation. So it's a reflection of the same issue. You don't have any form of you don't have any form of homogeneity. And the very interesting thing is that Marine Le Pen, who remains as the leader of the far-right party, has been really trying to deconstruct the anti-Semitic image from a father, who was Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was very present during the political life in the last 50 years even. And she's really trying to adopt a position of seduction, which is actually reflects an anti-Semitic unconscious, in the same way as with Trump. A politic of seduction toward the so-called Jewish community in France, as though this community was homogeneous. And so she's categorizing individuals, and she tries to get the support from the Jewish communities by antagonizing the Muslims. And very strangely, this has been working pretty well for her. She succeeded along the years to build a sort of some people say, some French Jewish citizens have been stating that somehow Marine Le Pen, this is true, she's coming from an anti-Semitic party, but she's stating truth on the account of Islam as an issue in France. So she's playing on this sort of antagonism between various expressions of anti-Semitic thought that might arise from radicalized Islamists, and the feeling by some French Jewish citizen that they are, in danger in such a context where Islam is so present through the presence of 6 million Muslims in France. So this is very contradictory and problematic. We can have a linear reading of that problem in France.
But perhaps some Jewish communities in France are really threatened, isn't it?
Really what? Excuse me?
But perhaps some Jewish communities in France are really threatened.
Of course. No, of course.
Their real experience.
Of course. No, there has been, as I was stating, what we have noticed is that anti-Semitism has been rising in France in the last few years. And very strangely, there is always, a movement, at the same time as Islamophobic actions and aggressions have been rising up, anti-Semitic actions have been also at the same time rising up. This has been noticed on many occasions. And if you are talking about, what happened with I don't know if you remember the so-called Affaire Mera, with the murdering of Jewish children in a school.
Yes.
This was an horrendous terrorist action that happened at that time, and I have been talking about this case with Marwan Mohamed, the sociologist who has been working with Abdel Ali Ajat on this book about Islamophobia as the manufacture of the elites in France. And he had a very interesting statement about that. That in some radicalized Islamist, or mostly by every radicalized Islamist, there is a strong position, a central position of anti-Semitic thought. Without that reflects actually the same, the same dialectic, that same system of the enemy we were talking about at the beginning, but taken from a different position. And in addition to that, because he has been able to meet a few people that were during his study that were part of the environment of the family of Mera. And there was another dimension to that, which is totally related to madness. This is the fact that he wanted to create an event. That the fact of targeting children was in itself very relevant in order to exist. And this is exactly what Mera was targeting at the same time. There was a strong anti-Semitic dimension, and in addition to that, there was something eventual. He wanted to create a sort of epiphany. And I guess this is also part of this, mediatic environment. He wanted to, the Prof is here. We are talking about this because it was incredibly eventual and terrible. So Mohamed was using a terminology to describe it. He told me Mera wanted to do un truc de ouf. He wanted to do a crazy thing. He has been finding a terminology which was oufiste. Ouf, this is fou in French. This is the reversed, the word fou, mad, in a reverse position. And this is frequently used in the vocabulary of people living in the French banlieue to do something totally mad. But it has been transposed in something horrific. And this is exactly what he wanted. There was a sort of concept, of urban concept in it that was part of his approach of targeting Jewish children, in addition to, of course, the anti-Semitic project. So yes.
Last question with Noach.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. And thank you for Selim for this very erudite and, as people have said, very dense lecture, which also the context, I mean, it's clearly situated on some level in a French context. And on some level it has universal aspects. And I think what I want to say is that some or suggest, maybe you think about it if you agree or don't agree, some things need to be separated here. Basically, I understand you as trying to bridge the concepts of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And I would like to ask, are they really, but maybe are they still two different things, right? How are these people hated? I'd like to point you to one of the factors in the anti-Semitic image, right? Which is this image of the Jew as lacking his own stable identity, as a kind of a virus, a vampire, somebody who can, trying to take over society, continuing on into the dolcheshtus, right? The stab in the back, kind of underhanded. This is a very feminine image of the Jew, right? As opposed to the image of the barbarian, which, as Manuela was saying, quote unquote Roman Muslim, Roman anti-Islamism before there is Islam, right? But nonetheless, the Roman attitude towards people who are living, the Berbers and so on, living in North Africa as barbarians, right? So I think basically, and these people are not generally conceived as lacking in power, effeminate, trying to grasp the government from underhand, etc. But rather as like overpowerful, overmasculine, misogynistic, etc., barbarians. I would say that maybe the key difference here is a discourse on blackness, connected to this idea of complete and versus this anti-Semitic discourse, and it's not a clear distinction. It's muddy. There's which is, I mean, it's an analytical problem. But I'd like to point out that it changes. I do think, getting back to what Manuela says, maybe it does change in 1948, right? Because the critiques of anti-Israel tend to be exactly on the lines of overpowerful, overmasculine, etc., etc. And I'd like to point out in this respect that many anti-Semitic, not all, but many of contemporary anti-Semitic movements, AfD, Breivik in Norway 2011, are pro-Israel. Right? They're pro-Israel because Israel takes the Jews out of Europe. If there were Jews coming back into Europe, then that would be a
precisely.
So maybe maybe it's not even two things. Maybe it's three things, right? It's anti-Islamism, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, and anti-Israelism. And we can't forget, of course, that we have Muslim anti-Semitism, which is not auto-anti-Semitism, but for example, like the general conception that Israel is the Nazi state, to say Zionist, say Nazi. This is a form. I mean, the problem is that you have several different forms which have relationships between them. It's complicated.
I totally agree with you. I don't know if you wanted to add something. No.
So you want to conclude, Selim? You close the seminar?
No, of course, I totally agree with what Noah has just said. There is this perception between, the devaluated feminine expression of a community that responds also to a misogynic perception, and on the other side, the strong patriarchal figure of the Israeli state, of a strong state. This reflects the two sides of the same coin, and there is, you make also the connection to Frantz Fanon with the sort of a priori, racial a priori made over the black people, especially by the French colonial empire. What he states in The Rachel of the Earth, or in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, he's also articulating that. And I think maybe, there is, I can only advise maybe to have a look at the work of an American scholar, Tracy McNulty. She has been reflecting on the interesting...
I know her. Yes.
You know her?
Yes, of course. She was in Cornell.
Exactly. And she wrote a wonderful book called The Hostess, where she's trying to analyze the origin of hostis in parties. So who is the master at home? Who is the ruler of the household? Who holds the domain or a territory? Who is really sovereign? And she shows very interestingly, connecting with Emile Benveniste, that the linguistic and semiotic approach of the question is very structural to the way our imaginary is articulated and works in relation with our definition of patriarchy, otherness. So when you are coming from, of course, there are many flexible or many figures. This might take different shapes. But this notion of who is the master at home is one of the roots of the issue I've been trying to develop today, I think. And McNulty is, I think, a very good reference to understand that.
Yes, excellent idea. So I want to thank you all, because first of all, I'm very happy for the lecture of telling and super interesting. And I hope that we will be able to do something also next year, maybe on the subject, on the different layers of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Maybe we can think about something about that.
Would be great.
We will meet again in the next seminars, and maybe we can organize a little meeting for the Vidal Sassoon people, but also are invited just to chat and to understand what's going on with each of us. I just want to announce that Victor he submitted his master thesis and he came out in an excellent, absolutely excellent. So
congratulations.
Our greetings. Everybody's, going ahead with their own work, and I hope to see you next time to the seminar. Even take care from Budapest. Thank you, Alon, for organizing everything. Martina, thank you to you too, and lots of kisses from Rome. Caput Mundi.
Thank you.
Not for many.